Welcome back to СивилНет. I'm your host, Patrick Elliott, and I'm joined by a friend of the show and political commentator, Eric Hacopian.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks for coming on as usual, Eric. John, tell us, let's start with the new defense package that we've just signed with France. I mean, it's very clearly a watershed moment for us. I would even call it the greatest diplomatic victory we've had in 120 years. I mean, this is something we've all been waiting and praying for. What are the implications of this other than the material help that we're going to get?
Well, it starts with that. This is a game changer based on things that are being discussed as far as what the weapon systems are. From what we know, it's about artillery, APCs, armored personnel carriers, and most importantly, air defense systems. And this is very significant because it creates deterrence capacity. Our biggest weakness since September of 2020 has been essentially in the air. And if you can close that or limit it, it makes a tremendous difference in making an attack on Armenia far less likely. So I think this is very significant, and obviously this has other components as far as training, special forces, doing audits every 6 months, I believe.
Every year,
and then you look at the gaps. Yeah. So this is exceptionally important.
This is a doctrinal shift in our military. This isn't symbolic stuff. This is going to build us a professional NATO standard military. It's doing on a wider scale what the Turks did with the Azeris, right? They took a group of special forces, prepared them, and then that's it. Here we're talking an institutional level. It's extremely exciting. Yeah, no, it is a watershed moment, and obviously there's some issues involved in deliveries and other issues, but we always have that because of our geography. But I suspect that they'll be solved in time. But this is one of those things that are actually underplayed rather than overplayed. Most things in politics have to be overplayed in national relations, but this has the real effect of giving us what we want, which is creating the groundwork for long-term security. Yeah, this is in a time where we haven't had good news in a really, really long time. This is Christmas come early. Let's turn to a little more difficult topic, specifically Vakif Khachatryan, who's now being put through a kangaroo court in Baku. Let's expand this to the other hostages held in Azerbaijan. I would even go so far back. I mean, we still are waiting for POWs from the 2020 war. When are we getting our people home? What's the holdup? What's going on? What do they want? Is it purely to terrorize us? Is there something there, some concession they're waiting for? What's going on here?
Well, I mean, on a practical level, it's concessions. But I think one thing about Vakif, which we all noted, is they lied to about what he had said in court. You know, in their translations, they said that he apologized when he actually did no such thing. I think, obviously, they're holding all of these people as hostages, and that's what they are. They're hostages for future chits, for future asks. But you have to understand in the context of a totalitarian state, it's an object of humiliation, and it's a way of it's a way to subjugate. It's a way to show power, that we can hold your people and you can't do anything about it. We can humiliate them. You can lie about them, and in a very real ways, it actually shows that the lack of meaning of this peace process, and this peace process that we've been involved with has resulted in genocide in Artsakh. Not only less POWs, we actually have more POWs, and no peace deal, and parts of Armenia occupied. So, but I think these people in particular, they're just tragic victims of a system and a country and a political system that is essentially based on lies, and in this case lying about them and humiliating them, and in the process showing the world what they're capable of us, and showing us that they have the ability to terrorize individual Armenians. In one case, one of the most important Armenians in the world, in Ruben Vartanyan. So I think that's this is a power play by a totalitarian state. On a practical level, these people are just chits for future concessions.
Can an argument be made that this is akin to right, the bread and circus in Roman times, right? Is that the people are suffering, and it's like, look how we're humiliating the Armenians.
Oh no, of course, the regime has nothing to offer it for people.
both economically, politically, in any form. So he needs to keep this conflict going, and this is simply another way of keeping the conflict going.
You mentioned this peace process that we've been in. The Prime Minister and other members of the government were up in Tbilisi last week, and they unveiled their Crossroads for Peace plan, which was essentially from an economic perspective, right? Putting Armenia as a transit hub from the region, right? North, south, east, west, and that does include our neighbors, the Turks and the Azeris. Of course, with the caveat that Armenia's territorial integrity must be recognized and respected. They insisted on sovereignty, but the emphasis was really on the economic prospects of this. What's your take on this? What are your thoughts on this? Is this a serious policy objective, or is this?
No.
No.
This is it's good public relations. I give them credit for coming up with the idea, because again, it puts this country on the side of integration and peace and other things, which most of the world will, even if they don't care, they'll have to say it's a good thing and nod their heads. But peace will not be achieved by trade. Peace will not be achieved by signing anything, and peace will not be achieved by diplomatic means. Peace will be achieved by the 3 steps. One is to have deterrence, which will give us the cold peace, sort of solidify the cold peace that we have now, which, by the way, that cold peace is the most likely long-term scenario. There is not going to be anything that's going to be signed. The second stage of that would be military parity, which will give you peace. And then in the long run, military superiority, which will give you security. Those are the 3 variables. Everything else is nonsense and a waste of time.
The budget for the year was unveiled, and one thing that I found particularly interesting, we have the highest military spending ever, not just proportionally, but literally, right, in terms of sheer numbers. Azerbaijan's at 2.8 billion, and we're closing in. It's between 1.4 and 1.8 billion, so we're closing that gap, which is significant. That being said, to me, the more interesting part was somewhere in the ballpark of $300 to $400 million US is for local production. What do you think of that?
Agnes, that's the best news, because ultimately, that kind of it's like, it's military Keynesianism. One, it meets the security needs of the country. It helps grow a military industrial complex inside of the country, which is already developing anyway. You'll just accelerate that, and it'll give them a permanent market internally. Obviously, these numbers will stay the same and grow over the years. So you're seeing the first sprouting of a serious military industrial complex, and they always start small, and they grow over time, and they eventually become internationally competitive. Secondly, given our geographic issues and weapons deliveries, it's very important for us to make the weapons locally. And this needs to expand over time into other things, so we don't have transportation issues with any of our neighbors. So we can produce, we're never going to produce all the weapons we need, but we can produce many of the weapons that we need, especially on the things that are most usable, most easy to produce, and most needed. However, I think in the long run, we need to have defense spending that's almost like 10% of GDP.
Well, I think we're at 5.4, 5.6, something like that.
I think that's good, but if you're going to have parity and superiority over time, I think you need to get to around 10% of GDP, and our GDP is constantly growing, so it's doable.
That comes at the expense of other services.
It does,
right?
But we're about building a garrison state, and security comes first, because all other issues can catch up.
But then we kind of have to walk this tightrope, right? Where you do want to build a state that's livable, where people can prosper, because then otherwise they're going to leave. And then so they can stay and make babies, which can then feed into the military industrial complex that can then secure us, right? So we have to, there's always that trade-off. It's about walking that.
Of course. Yeah. But if you have a continually growing economy, that solves its own problems over time.
Yeah. Well, that's why, right? It's about allocating expenses. The interesting part, I was watching this, I was reading, it's from the Baku Research Institute, which is one of the rare, somewhat coherent think tank.
They're actually very good.
Yeah, that comes out of that country. But they were talking about how the Azeri overall budget in general is extremely opaque, right? The levels of corruption is fantastical stuff. We're all aware of that. And what a lot of people miss is that the military budget is the most opaque segment of an already opaque spending. So when we're talking that their budget is 2.8 billion, we don't really know where a lot of that's going. We don't know how well that's being used. The point, I'm just saying that there's no rational reason to despair. We should be worried. We should be preparing, but there's no reason to despair. The odds are not insurmountable.
No, I don't really care what they do or what's real and what's not. I only care about what we do. And all I know is that the road to peace is through first deterrence, then equity, and then superiority. Yeah. That's the road to peace.
The Israel model is actually quite interesting, and I'm not talking, everyone says Israel, we need like the IDF. I'm talking about the economic model. Essentially, the government behaved like a venture capitalist firm, right? So they treated all these military industrial complex companies as startups. And so they would send them seed money, they would fund them, and they kind of hedged their bets. And in return, right, the profits of the company would go back into taxpayer coffers so that the state would get rich. So that allowed these companies to create this ecosystem and to grow really, really fast because they had unlimited money, right? They had taxpayer dollars coming in, and that fed back into the system. Do you foresee something like this happening in Armenia? Because the news of this spending is like, where does this come from? This 400 million?
I mean, it could very well be. I've heard certain things along those lines, but nothing exact. I'm not, and some of these things are best not discussed. So I think we better just move on to something else.
Let's talk about our friend. Let's talk about the abusive ex-girlfriend to the north who messages us at 3 a.m. on Facebook, going, "Why are you in photos with other people?" Now that we have France coming, what's Russia's reaction to this?
Well, I mean, they're on full meltdown mode. I think we're soon will be moving into the economic retaliation zone. But I mean, they've tried everything. They tried ethnic cleansing to overthrow this government and to bring down our constitutional system. They've tried other extracurricular methods, which didn't work. So on the short run, I see nothing but deterioration in Russian-Armenian relations. Some of it driven by actions or statements by the Armenian side, but I think I can be very critical of this particular government in its general or particular approaches on foreign policy, but Russia's issues with us are not about this policy or that policy. It's really existential in nature. They do not support a free system of government or economic direction or political direction. And now, because of their own betrayals, they pivot to the West. So unfortunately, I think their issues with us are existential, and the only way they'll be happy is if we're Belarus with apricots and cognac, and that's not something that's acceptable to most people in this country.
Yeah. Belarus with the potatoes and the vodka, and us with the apricots and the cognac. It's actually interesting because we seem to have a rapprochement between Armenia and Ukraine. And I know for a fact, I've had people off the record tell me that, when some of our IT companies have reached out to Ukrainian companies, the response was, we don't do business with Armenian companies because they're not supporting us in the war. Granted, this was a year ago, but there does seem to be some kind of rapprochement between the two. Do you think that this is further going to irk Russia?
Well, of course. I'm not particularly sure how realistic or useful many of these things are, but I think anything Ukraine-related around the world, unless you're sending in weapons at this point, is symbolic in nature.
Well, the spokesman for the president met with Armen Grigoryan, the head of the Security Council, and essentially what they agreed was to cooperate on Euro integration with Armenia. So Ukraine would support Armenia's further divorce from Russia, right, for lack of a better term.
Well, given the fact that Ukraine itself is not integrated into EU, so I don't know how much help they could be. At this point, I chalk this up as all symbolic.
Tell us a little bit about the prospects for the opening of the border between Turkey and Armenia. We're discussing this. I'll tell you specifically. There was a European study that came out. I think it was 2 weeks ago, that looked at the economic benefits, and as opposed to a lot of stuff we've looked at here, the conclusion was pretty clear that Armenia would be benefiting significantly in terms of trade, not just with Turkey, but the idea is to bypass Turkey and to have railroads and highway into Europe, into Greece, Bulgaria, and so on. Greece was already a good friend of ours. So what's your take on this? What's your take on or is it not even worth discussing? Because there's no point. They're not going to open anything.
They're not going to open anything at this point. I'm not sure about this study or that study. I think there's a lot of X factors we don't know because everybody looks at transportation, and that's a very small. In most businesses, transportation is not the primary cost. Yeah. And if you look at you have to look at our vulnerabilities. We're both members of WTO, and you can have cheap Turkish agricultural products put hundreds of thousands of people out of work in this country, or threaten their living. And this would be some of the poorest people in this country. So I think these things are somewhat not well thought out, and sometimes they're just looked at it from a point of view of an economist and not on the point of view of someone growing cucumbers in Ijivan. So I think, but it's sort of a moot point. I do not see the border opening at this point until there's regime change in Baku or there's regime change in Turkey. I just don't see it in the short run.
So you think a lot of this is just lip service too?
It's absolute lip service. Everything in Turkey related over the last, everything that every standard they've ever had has been met. And they're not opening the border.
There's always some new condition.
Yeah, there's always
some statute that offends them.
Yeah. So I think at this point, I think we have to move on. Listen, this country has had dramatic economic growth for many, many years with a closed border, and economies adjust.
We have a wartime, but by definition, we have a wartime economy, which explains a lot of why during the 44 days of fighting, the economy wasn't in a tailspin, the currency didn't collapse, unfortunately, with those constraints. We've adapted, but that also means that the potential for explosive growth is just right around the corner if we have more connectivity and more transportation, right?
I mean, okay, transportation. What do we export that gets transported by truck that's relevant? Mm. You're not going to export agricultural products to Europe via Turkey or to Turkey. So if you look at the leading economic sectors in this country, none of them have anything to do with transportation.
Well, what about diamonds and mining?
It's diamonds, IT, and banking. Those are the three biggest sectors in our Armenian economy now, most profitable ones. And none of them have anything, with diamonds, you put things on a plane and you send it. So I think one thing that this blockade has done is to force us to go into much higher value businesses rather than the Georgian model. Where they have access to the world, and where has it gotten them?
Seems like a good place to to conclude. Thanks a lot, Eric. Appreciate having you on.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks again for watching CivilNet. I'm Patrick, and we'll catch you very soon.